Years ago, man, I am old, but let's say mid-90s, I worked as a woodland firefighter while in the Army Reserves. I worked as a spotter, basically stationed in a giant fire tower in the middle of a national park. My job was just as it sounds. I would use binoculars and look out for fire, smoke, and other telltale signs of fire. My nearest compadre was 5 miles or so from me. My days consisted of working my shift, taking long walks around the fire tower, being on the lookout for anyone who might be having illegal fires, looking out for wildlife, and staying afoot of bears and wolves. The way our shifts worked back then was 1 week on, 1 week off. So we slept in the towers, cooked our food, etc. There were nearby toilets and showers for our use. One day, I came across an illegal bear trap. I had several ranger friends, and I safely set off the trap. Later, during a trip in my Jeep to get food, I picked up the trap to take it to the ranger station. Poaching is illegal in the park and carried a big fine even back then, along with some jail time, but it did not stop the poachers from trying. I heard rifle shots and headed back to my fire tower. We did have a rifle in the tower to be used in cases of emergencies. Just a few months back, a fellow spotter had been mauled to death by a grizzly, so each tower had been outfitted with a rifle. I looked with my binoculars but did not see anything out of the ordinary. I radioed my coworker, Ben, an older guy in the adjacent tower. He hadn't heard anything today but had come across a few traps himself. That night, after a dinner of franks and beans and toast, I was writing to my future wife when I heard the rumbling of a truck, thinking it might be Ben. Occasionally he made the trek over and we would crack open a soda and chew the fat for a bit. Instead, I saw 4 men with rifles get out of the truck. One looked around and leaned up against the truck while the other 3 grabbed traps and began to set them up. I grabbed the rifle and my lantern and headed down the stairs. I was only 21, a farmer's son from a rural Virginia farming town, and even with 1 deployment behind me, I was naive. I should have called it in to the Rangers, but instead, I thought I could talk some sense into 4 dangerous men. I barely got a, "Hey, what are you doing?" out of my mouth before I was roughly shoved by rough hands. My lantern fell and I heard it crack. The rifle was kicked away from me, and I felt the breath leave my chest when I was violently kicked in the stomach. I barely had caught my breath when I was grabbed by 2 of the men and was shoved forward into the woods. It seemed like we walked for miles, but in reality it was probably only a mile. However, I noticed that there were no sounds. In the forest, it is rarely silent. It's a cacophony of sounds, even at night. Wolves, crickets, but on this night, nothing. Suddenly I was shoved onto my knees and I felt hot tears well up. I thought of my parents, my little sister and brother, and my fiancé back home in Virginia. I heard the rack of a gun, and I shut my eyes and prayed. Suddenly, the night erupted. However, it was the sounds of sirens, those of the forest rangers, and behind them in his pickup was Ben, who had tried to radio me that he had heard a car's engine and came to my tower when I didn't reply. The poachers were arrested. Ben drove me back to the tower. I was still shaking. He didn't lay into me for not following procedure, just said, "That was close, kid." I ended up leaving the job months later to take a job closer to home, but I never ran into any more poachers during the rest of my time. I grew up in the countryside, right next to a national park frequently visited by nature lovers and bird enthusiasts. It was the kind of park where you weren't really allowed to bike or ride horses, only walk or run, but 10-year-old me thought it was a stupid rule and did so anyway, because the trails were perfect for it. I knew fully well that I wasn't supposed to do that and was caught a few times, but nothing much came of it apart from a half-hearted, "don't do it again." And I did, of course, until one day something frightening happened that made me stop. My family were horse breeders, and I would often take one of the horses for a ride, usually in the Forbidden Park. This day, very early in the morning, the first day of the summer holiday, it was beautiful outdoors, misty and foggy, yet with a sky that promised a sunny day ahead. Since it was so early, before 6 o'clock, I knew there wouldn't be anyone on the trail to see me, so I let the horse set off at full speed along the trail. I only slowed down on the part of the trail that got steep on one side, leading down to the river, because the thought of one step too close to the edge was too much even for a kid with next to non-existent risk assessment skills. Suddenly, the horse came to a halt and refused to take another step. I grew up with horses all my life, and knew that usually indicates that you need to investigate. Is there something with the hooves? Did the horse spot something that spooked it? The hooves were fine, but the horse didn't move an inch. That's when I saw it. Someone had set up a trap, a thin, sharp metal wire across the trail, at perfect neck height for an adult. I stopped and looked around, but didn't see anyone. The wire was well attached to two trees and impossible for me to remove, so I led the horse around it, and to do so I had to walk a bit up into the wooded area on the side of the trail. That is when I heard the singing. There is this Swedish song and he was singing that melody, but the lyrics were different and sung in a muffled, sniggering voice. Today I only remember parts of it, but translated it would have been something like, "Hey, all you runners, come here passing, let the lifeblood pour out." As silently as I could and with my heart in my throat, I backed away, got up on the horse, and hurried back the way I came as fast as I could. I knew I had to tell someone about it, but at the same time wanted to avoid admitting to riding a huge and very forbidden horse on those protected trails. So now I had a problem. The old stories about a mad old man living in the shed in the woods, a shed that was once a cottage for the local hunter, came back to me as I hung on to the horse for dear life. I got home and told my older brother what had happened, and he went back there with me in tow. We found the wire trap, and after a while of searching, we also found a spear-like pole in the ground, right on the spot where you'd land if you came running and jumped over the fallen tree on the trail. That's when we called the police. The area was searched and several similar traps were found, but no sight of the old man. The following summer, though, there were big news in the local paper about spear-like poles being found right under the water surface, directly under that little tower you're supposed to dive from at the lake, and black garbage bags filled with big rocks were found on the narrow bridge crossing the river, so that if a car had hit it, there was a risk it would have gone off the road and into the water. So I take my dad's ashes up to Glacier National Park every year. I lived in Colorado when this story happened, and I was headed south through Idaho after I had visited Montana. My car broke down in Salmon, Idaho, and a nice man helped me out. I was headed through the mountains to Boise to visit a friend. It was about a 5-hour drive. Before I entered the truly mountainous section of Idaho, I saw a hot spring on the side of this 2-lane highway along the Salmon River. I decided to take a dip after the stress of having my car break down. The hot spring had a bathhouse up at the top near the road, and a wheelchair ramp that went down to the area near the springs, where they were on the side of the river. People had created little bath-shaped sections in the river that were separated by river stones. Actually, you could sit in a spot that was shaped like a hot tub, so that it held the water from the hot springs while the river rushed over it. I got out of my car and headed down to the hot spring, taking my dog with me. It was twilight. About every half an hour, a car passed by. Knowing that I was alone, I took off my top. I was sitting in the hot spring and actually took a photo of a car approaching. The car pulled up next to mine, in front of the bathhouse. It was a truck with 3 men in it. Seamlessly, 1 man got out of the driver's side, and 2 men got out of the passenger side. They moved without qualms and were covered in heavy black gear. They looked like hunters. I couldn't see the expressions on their faces. The driver headed down the wheelchair ramp towards me, not hesitating. He took big, long strides. I recognized that there was danger. The 2 passengers from the other side of the car headed down the steep bank along the wheelchair ramp, taking a shortcut. I was stuck in between both parties. Hastening, I hid and dressed myself underwater while my dog growled. I've only heard him growl twice in my life, and this was the second time. The driver kept on walking towards me. He walked out onto the rocks into the river, continuously walking towards me, even though he was covered in heavy gear that could get him waterlogged if he fell in the river. The other 2 passengers from the side of the car were also walking out on the rocks, directly in front of me. The driver got so close that I had to grab my dog before he lashed out at the driver. I was freaking out. The man was walking out onto the stones so that he could reach me. He was not hesitating. I grabbed my phone, my keys, and my clothes, and I dragged my dog between the 2 parties, my heart pounding in my ears. The driver didn't stop. He quickly turned around, making an arc and still coming for me with big strides. The passengers were also walking towards me, trapping me between them. I ran up the bank, practically dragging my dog by his collar all the way to my car. To avoid being grabbed, I threw my dog into the back seat and lunged into the passenger side door of my car. I threw my keys into the ignition and turned them right when the men were walking up between my car and theirs. I happened to hit the lock button on the door right when they walked up. Before anything else happened or before I saw their faces, I ended up throwing myself into the driver's seat, reversing my car, and hightailing it out of there. I drove about 20 minutes down the road. I crossed the river on a bridge and hid my car behind a bank near other campers. It was well hidden from the main road. The campers were looking at me, wondering what was going on. I drove about 20 minutes down the road. I crossed the river on a bridge and hid my car behind a bank near other campers. It was well hidden from the main road. The campers were looking at me, wondering what was going on. I sat and I waited. Another 10 minutes passed by, and lo and behold, the truck drove by. The hunters were looking for me. I managed to wait another half an hour, and then drove up to the mountains, over to Boise, and into safety.